A very pleasant morning to each one of you present here. I, Vidita Rakhe, Assistant Professor, JLU School of Law, welcome you all to this International Igniting Minds lecture series. Today, we are highly honored by the presence of the speaker of today's session, Professor Dr. Stephen Freeland. Professor Dr. Stephen Freeland is Professor of International Law at Western Sydney University, Australia, where he specializes in international criminal law, commercial aspects of space law, public international law, and human rights law. He was formerly Dean of School of Law at Western Sydney University from 2017 to 2019. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Vienna, permanent visiting professor at the I-Courts Center of Excellence for International Courts, University of Copenhagen, adjunct professor at the University of Hong Kong, senior fellow at the London Institute of Space Policy and Research. He has been an expert assessor for government research councils in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Hong Kong, South Africa, and the United States, and has taught various aspects of international law at the universities in over 20 countries. He has also been a visiting professional within the appeals chamber at the International Criminal Court and a special advisor to the Danish Foreign Ministry in matters related to ICC. He has represented the Australian government at various United Nations conference and committee meetings and has advised the Australian, New Zealand, and several other governments on issues related to national and international regulation of space activities and the development of a national space industry strategy. He sits on the editorial board of the Canada-based Annals of Air and Space Law, the German-based German Journal of Air and Space Law, the China-based Space Law Review, the London-based Room Space Law Journal, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Planetary Science, and on the advisory board of the Indian-based Asian Journal of Air and Space Law. He has authored approximately 300 publications on various aspects of international law and has been invited to present over 1,300 expert commentaries by national and international media outlets worldwide on wide range of legal and geopolitical issues. Sir, I request you to kindly address the gathering.
Oh, thank you so much, Ms. Racker. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. Hello to everybody. I'm speaking to you from Sydney, Australia, where it is late afternoon on Friday. We've had a lovely day. I hope this finds you all safe and well in these difficult times. We hear that there are some difficulties in your country, as there have been in mine, regarding the COVID crisis, and I urge you all to stay safe and well and do all the right things, because together we will overcome this. I also, as is customary whenever I speak, want to tell you that the land on which I'm staying, this is my house that I'm speaking to you, as many of you are of course in your houses, is land that has been occupied by human beings, by our Indigenous people, for over 65,000 years. It's the Australian Indigenous culture is a very old culture. 65,000 years represents over 2,500 generations of people, and it's always interesting for me to reflect, and for my colleagues to reflect, on the culture and the richness of the people on whose land I am. Unfortunately, you can't see this very well. I should take this off, but one of my things is I sit on the advisory panel of the Australian Space Agency, and the logo, there we go, the logo of the panel is not very well seen, is a map of Australia with lots of different dots, and those dots in there represent our Indigenous people's view of space. And so I'm going to talk to you today about space and the legal frameworks, the geopolitical frameworks, but it's important to reflect that space is also a highly cultural and religious area. It's obviously highly economic, it's obviously highly strategic, and it has military aspects. It's obviously scientific. There are many, many aspects of space that are important. It's also, in a sense, ubiquitous. That is, that you and I use space every day. Without even thinking about it, we would use it 10, 20 times. You wouldn't be able to hear me and see me without space. In your phones, and many of you will have phones, of course we have GPS and we have lots of other capabilities in there that are only enabled by way of space technology. When you want to know the weather forecast, you rely on space technology. For agricultural management, you rely on space technology. For navigation purposes, for aircraft and shipping, you rely on space technology. For financial transactions, using your automatic teller machines, you rely on space technology. For disaster management, you rely on space technology. And the list goes on and on and on. So even though for many of you in the audience, you might think, why are we having a lecture about space, let alone the regulation of space? Space is not important. Hopefully, you'll begin to get a feel that space is indeed integral to our lives. It's integral to every person in India in various ways, as it is in my country and in every other country. And of course, you would also be aware that India itself is a major spacefaring nation. You have ISRO, of course, your pseudo agency, if you like. You have a budding entrepreneurial and private space sector. Obviously, space has strategic and military value for India, and you will all be aware that, for example, India, about a year and a half ago, tested an ASAT weapon where it deliberately destroyed one of its own satellites. Now, I will have some things to say about that perhaps later in my talk. But all of that goes to reflect on the point that space is an incredibly important part of the way that your country and mine, but your country functions. But more than that, space and the ubiquity of space is integrally tied up to the future of humanity. Our relationship with space, the way we interact with space, the way we respect space, and the way we utilize space in a sustainable way will inevitably reflect on how humanity will proceed in the future. And even though you might think that sounds like a very, very broad statement, and it is, hopefully through some of the things that I've have to say today, you might just get a feel about how important space is, and therefore how important our behavior in utilizing space is. I've had the pleasure of working for industry, for governments. I've worked for 9 countries in helping them in shaping their space laws and policies. Ms. Raka very kindly mentioned that I've represented my country at the United Nations on issues to do with space. And I've also recently been appointed by the United Nations to chair multilateral discussions through a committee at the United Nations, which is the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is one of the largest UN committees. And that committee has appointed me and a Polish lawyer to co-chair the discussions amongst the 95 member states, including India, which is a very active member, regarding resource exploitation. You might have all heard of plans by many to, if you like, mine the moon or whatever. And so part of my role is to coordinate the discussions on a multilateral basis to try to find the way that we might undertake those activities and what the rules of the road are and should be. And that's going to be a difficult but important conversation, because different countries will have different perspectives on those sorts of activities, different capabilities, different agendas, and my role, hopefully, is to help all of the voices get together in the room, and ultimately, after difficult discussions, we'll find an agreed consensual path forward. And that is really my message today. You will see in what I have to say that space involves so many elements. And even though there are some countries with greater capabilities than others, for example, India is a major spacefaring country, in the end, space impacts on all countries. And indeed, there is a common interest amongst all countries to ensure that as we move forward in the way we interact with space, we do that in a way that is safe, secure, and sustainable. And because of the multifaceted nature of space, we need to ensure that every voice is heard as we develop the path forward in our behaviour. Of course, every country, India, Australia, and every other country, will of course want to engage with space in a way that maximises its own advantages, its own capabilities, develops its own economy and its industries, protects its national security, develops its science and its research. Every country will want to maximise the benefits for themselves. But the perspective is also broader than that, that in maximising the benefits for yourself, you have to ensure that you don't at the same time compromise the ability of others to use space. Because in the end, and this will be my final message right at the end of this talk, if one country behaves irresponsibly and crosses certain lines in space, then we ruin it for every country. If I do something perhaps deliberately in an attempt to compromise your ability to utilize space, I may succeed in that, but what I also succeed is compromising my own ability to utilize space. And so there's, notwithstanding all of the geopolitical tensions and differences we have on Earth, let's call it terrestrially, there is a common interest in the way we use space to ensure that it's sustainable for the future. So what I'm going to do now is hopefully be able to share my screen with you. Now, could somebody just tell me that you can see my slides? Can you see my slides? Somebody just,
yes, sir.
I can't, yeah, that's great. So this is my topic, safeguarding humanity and embracing technology, challenges for the future regulation of outer space. It sounds very broad, it is very broad, but I hope that some of the messages that I give you will make it interesting for you. I hope you will all become space junkies at the end of this talk and realize that space is important. There are, of course, many, many other issues that are of equal importance. And of course, the world has to deal with the COVID situation at the moment. That's clearly a high priority. And space is also relevant for that, in helping us in many ways monitoring the situation in countries. But this is an area that is important for everybody. So let us begin this journey. I should also mention that that the organisers have said that you have a chat function or a Q&A function, so please enter your questions and then our moderator will ask any questions at the end. There'll be plenty of time for your questions. So let us begin. Remember, I'm an international lawyer, and so we need to, in a sense, look at the legal status of space. But remember, space is much more than just about law. Okay, so what is outer space? You clearly would be aware that there is such a concept, But how is that determined from a legal perspective? Well, let me tell you that in 1957, we very quickly learnt that answer, almost instantaneously. Now, some of you may be aware that in 1957, two important things happened. The first important thing happened is that I was born. So I am a Sputnik baby. I was born to talk about space, because the other much more important thing that happened in 1957 is that the Soviet Union sent up into Earth orbit the first human-made object. It was a small satellite called Sputnik 1. Some of you would have heard of it. And that immediately raised legal questions about what was the legal nature of the area in which Sputnik was operating. So Sputnik went up to an altitude, it varied somewhat between about 200 and 400 kilometers above the Earth, and then orbited the Earth for about 3 months, obviously overflying many countries and sending back some fairly preliminary signals to the mission control in the Soviet Union. And that raised a lot of questions. It raised a lot of questions about sovereignty and jurisdiction. So before Sputnik, when humans had not made it into space, there had been a lot of, if you like, theoretical discussion about how far does a country's sovereignty extend above its land. Now, you'd all be aware that, of course, every country has airspace above it. And certainly by 1957, but well before that, we had determined that international law what the legal status of the airspace was. Indeed, international law is often reactive and reactive to technology. So, talking about airspace, the technology of aeroplanes was developed in the early 1900s. The First World War, sadly, wars are very good at developing technology. The First World War saw the development of airplane technology. At the end of the First World War, in 1919, as the discussions were going on about what the world would do from that point going forward, there was a recognition that we had this technology, airplanes, that allowed you to go from point to point, from country to country. And that required an understanding about what the legal status of the area where the airplane would travel would be. And so in 1919, a treaty, an agreement between many countries was agreed in Paris. It's called the Paris Convention of 1919, which said that airspace, the airspace above a country, is part of its jurisdictional sovereignty. So in practical terms, that means the airspace above India is subject to Indian law. Your government, your parliament can pass any law it wants that regulates Indian airspace. If I want to fly an aeroplane into India, I need the permission of India to fly into its airspace, by and large. So airspace was clearly an area of jurisdiction for the underlying country, requiring permission to operate there. So when Sputnik went up, it flew to the altitudes that I mentioned, excuse me, and clearly overflew other countries. And guess what happened? No country said, get off my territory. No country said, you're trespassing. No country said, you need my permission. So quite clearly, it was recognized immediately that where Sputnik was in this Earth orbit was somewhere beyond airspace. Airspace being part of the national jurisdiction of a country. It was recognized that there was something above airspace, so we will call it outer space, which is what we call beyond national jurisdiction. So what that means in practice is Indian law applies to the airspace above India, but Indian law does not regulate the outer space above India. Outer space is what we call an area beyond national jurisdiction. Therefore, we need to regulate it in some way. We can't say, therefore, it's not regulated at all. Because if you had this area beyond national jurisdiction, but there was no other form of jurisdiction, then ultimately that area would be destroyed. So let me give you an example just to clarify. A similar area that you might be more familiar with that is beyond national jurisdiction is the high seas. You might be aware that the waters are divided by international law into various zones, one area being the high seas. That's an area beyond national jurisdiction, like outer space. Therefore, Indian law does not apply to the high seas. It applies to Indian ships in the high seas. That's a different issue. That applies to the law on the ship. It doesn't apply to the high seas. So imagine if there was no international law regulating the high seas. There's no national law. Imagine if there was no international law, if it was an area that essentially belonged to no one. What would happen? Countries would go to the high seas and they would dump their waste products and whatever. And what would happen? You would destroy the high seas very quickly. There's a sociological phenomenon known as the tragedy of the commons. So therefore, it's important in these areas beyond national jurisdiction to say, even though it's not national law, we still need law. And that law is international law. The governance structures are international, multinational, agreed on this multinational basis. And that's really important. And that is the case for the high seas. It is also the case for outer space. We have treaties. I'll briefly walk you through that. So the next question, when we've decided what the legal status of outer space is, the obvious question that I'm sure you're all asking. If we say that Indian law applies to airspace above India, but does not apply and cannot apply to the outer space above India, the obvious question is, where is the demarcation? Where does airspace end? Where does the sovereignty and the jurisdiction of India end above its territory? An obvious question, and as a lawyer we need to know that, because we're talking about two completely different types of legal governance for these two areas, one national law, one international law. That said, we still don't know the answer to that fundamental question. Of course, it's been discussed many times. There have been many reasons postulated as to why we need this demarcation and where it should be and how it should be calculated. But essentially, for political reasons, we have not had international consensus and therefore do not have international agreement about where this demarcation is. So we know that Indian law applies to Indian airspace, but we don't exactly know where the airspace ends and where the outer space begins. And that's a political decision. The spacefaring nations do not yet feel comfortable to have that demarcation because they are constantly developing their technology to allow them to do more and more things in quote unquote space. And therefore, they don't want this demarcation, because once you have the demarcation, they clearly cannot operate below that certain point wherever it is. And so the major spacefaring nations, by and large, would rather keep the question open. I suspect at some stage we will have a demarcation, but we don't have it as yet. Okay. If you're going to take anything away from this talk, besides the fact that space is important, it's this line. Space is not lawless. There is a lot of law that regulates space. I've already talked about it being under international law. So whenever you hear people talk about space being lawless, or worse still, as some people have said, space being the wild, wild west. Please take my word for it, that is not correct. There's been a lot of law developed over the time immediately following Sputnik. Remember I said Sputnik led to this almost instantaneous recognition about the legal status of law, and then obviously principles flow from that. So in the period between 1957 and 1967, there was lots of discussion in reaction to the development of space technology. There were many United Nations General Assembly resolutions which essentially demonstrated that there was agreement on fundamental principles. Those fundamental principles are then reflected in a series of treaties that are agreed, drafted and agreed through that committee I mentioned, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, UNCOPOS, as you can see on the screen. And we have a series of 5 treaties between the period of 1967 and 1979 that deal with various aspects of space. And India is a party to the first 4 and is a signatory, not a party, but a signatory to the 5th one, the Moon Agreement. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is a framework treaty setting out fundamental principles that guide us really well. And I'll put up on another slide briefly some of those fundamental principles. So we have a series of binding obligations and rights that arise from these principles that are important. They were important, they are important, and they will continue to be important moving on into the future. Why do we have no more treaties since 1979? Again, politics plays a part in that. Excuse me. The discussions in that Moon Agreement were about the idea, even at that stage, of perhaps, if I may use the expression, mining the moon. Remembering that the Apollo missions had brought back many kilos of samples of moon rock, and the scientific community, pardon me, had looked at those samples, and there was more and more interest in the idea of perhaps going back and mining the moon. Of course, it didn't happen, although that discussion is now very much at the forefront again. And as I mentioned, I have the honour of chairing the UN discussions on that point now. But it was already an issue in the 1970s. And those discussions were going on about, well, how do we set up a system to exploit the resources in an area that essentially belongs to all of us? Interestingly enough, at exactly the same time, the same discussions were going on in another area beyond national jurisdiction. I mentioned the high seas. There was discussion at the same time about mining what's called the deep seabed, which is the floor of the ocean under the high seas. Again, an area beyond national jurisdiction. And there were discussions going on in the context of negotiating another treaty, which ultimately is known as UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was agreed in 1982. So you can see these are being discussed at exactly the same time. And in both of those discussions, this idea of exploiting the resources of an area that essentially is a commons for all of us, belongs to all of us, doesn't belong to you alone or me alone. It's a common area. And the discussions about what sort of frameworks might exist if we are to exploit those areas. And it's a really difficult issue. Think of space, or think of the deep seabed as being a cake. And think of that cake being, of course, something that we all have a stake in collectively. We all manage it. We all are in a position where we should benefit from. And then you see me standing at the cake, eating the cake. It's a lovely cake. I'm really enjoying it. And then I'm joined by somebody else who's also eating the cake. And you are over there, and you say to me, please, Professor Freeland, stop eating that cake, because that cake belongs to all of us. And if you keep eating it, there'll be nothing left for me, for all of us. I know that's a really silly example, but you get the idea. And I would respond to you as someone who is able to get to that cake. I would say, that's fine. Please, please come and join us. You also can eat this cake. But I say that knowing full well that it's extremely difficult for you to actually come and be able to engage in that activity, because you don't necessarily have that capability. And that is, in a very, very crude and simplistic way, the sorts of discussions that took place about how we gain those benefits from space, because space requires an incredible amount of technical expertise. It requires money, it requires research, it requires a whole range of things. Many countries do not have that capability. Even today, there are perhaps, well, let's say 60 or 70 countries in the world that have space capabilities. Of course, India is a major power. Amongst those 60 or 70 countries who have capabilities, there's a great difference about what they can and cannot do. But at least they have some capability. Some are the very major powers, some have much fewer capabilities but can do some things. So already there's a divide in capability between them. But also going further, that means that there's, let's say, another 120, 130 countries in the world that have absolutely no space capability at this stage. They are entirely, because space is important to everybody and they need access to that technology for all the things that I've mentioned, they are entirely reliant on their friends, on other countries to actually get access. So you can see there's a great divide in capability in access to this area that belongs to all of us. And so those institutionalized and philosophical discussions came to the forefront when we were discussing the mining of the moon in the Moon Agreement, when we were discussing the mining of the deep seabed in UNCLOS, and both of those treaties essentially came to the point where countries by majority vote, because many of the countries that were participating in those discussions at the time had been fairly recently former colonies, and former colonies typically have not been treated very well by their colonial masters. Now, obviously, it varies greatly amongst former colonies, so I generalize here, and I'm not making any particular statement about India or anywhere else. But in many colonies, the colonial masters would take the resources, rape and pillage the resources for their own benefit. Many of those colonies in the 60s, in the 70s, became independent countries through the process of decolonization that was enacted through the United Nations Charter. And once you're a former colony and you now are independent, as your country is clearly demonstrative of the fact, you become fiercely independent. And then when you see again an area to which we all have a stake being utilized by one or two or three or four major countries to the exclusion of others because of capability, of course you will stand up and you'll say, well, this is not right and this is not in accordance with what we want. And so in both the Moon Agreement and UNCLOS, the majority said, all right, well, if we are going to engage in these activities, let's do it sustainably and safely, of course, but let's also include a benefit sharing mechanism within those regimes. And that's included in the Moon Agreement, that's included in UNCLOS, and you can imagine what happened. The major countries, the industrialized countries at the time, the countries who at that stage were most likely to have the capability and wherewithal to actually engage in the activities said, we're not going to engage, we're not going to be part of this process. They had to fix UNCLOS 12 years later in 1994 to bring in the industrialized countries. But with the Moon Agreement, it hasn't changed. It only has 18 states parties and 4 signatories. India is a signatory. So we don't have any more treaties, but that's not to say we haven't stopped lawmaking in space. And so since the 1980s, when it became clear that it's very difficult to get what you might call hard law treaties, we've had lots of other types of instruments that may not be traditional in their international law shape, but they regulate behaviour, they formulate how we're going to act in space, and they take the form of General Assembly principles, and we have guidelines and codes of conduct on a whole range of different behavioural norms in space. And in the end, law, be they hard through the treaties or soft through these other mechanisms, or you see their TCBMs, in space we talk about transparency and confidence building measures. So through all of those, the whole notion is to regulate behaviour so that we are responsible, so that we do not do things that threaten to bring us to this tragedy of the commons that I referred to. So we have lots of international law. We also have the emergence of national law. Now, remember I said Indian national law does not apply to outer space, but Indian national law applies and would apply to Indian nationals engaging in space. And so as space has become more open, so it's no longer just countries engaged in space, but as you know, and another slide will demonstrate, there's a lot of commercial activity, a huge space economy. Countries have more and more, and this is part of their obligations under the international treaties, but also it makes sense from a national governance viewpoint, developing national law to regulate those within their jurisdiction, to ensure that they engage in space in a responsible way, but also in a way that is in accordance with the particular country's risk profile, national security interests, industry ambitions, and many other things. So there's more and more national space law, and I know India, and there's lots of discussions in your country about your national space law. I've had the privilege of helping 8 or 9 countries in the development of their national law and policy, and more countries will do this. So there's a lot of law dealing with space. And there's a lot of other law at the international level that is relevant for us to look at. So space involves environmental issues and human rights issues. And because military is a part of it, humanitarian law, the laws of war issues, and trade and security and telecommunications, and many other aspects. So there are lessons to be learned from other areas of international law. However, that is different from saying they instantly apply in their terrestrial form to this extraterrestrial environment. That's not the case, because space is unique, as you're getting a feel for. It's an area beyond national jurisdiction. It has unique capabilities and characteristics. We need to develop on an ongoing basis the legal governance structures and policies that best serve that uniqueness. So there are lessons to be learned from all of those areas and others of international law that are on your screen that have been developed with terrestrial eyes, but they might have some lessons that you can weave and adapt and change and learn from that would also apply at this unique level of space. So that's an ongoing process. I mentioned at the outset that space was highly political, and you're getting a feel for that. So let me just raise that in this discussion. I mentioned on the 4th of October, we've just had the anniversary of Sputnik. We are in fact in World Space Week at the moment. So that was, I think, one of the reasons that your esteemed Dean Shrivastava invited me to speak this week. This is World Space Week, emanating from the fact that Sputnik took place was launched on the 4th of October 1957. That gave rise to these immediate issues. It took place, of course, we're in the midst of a deep geopolitical crisis, the Cold War. And the technology of space at that time was very much, and still is to a certain degree, based on notions that this is military technology, this is missile technology. And indeed, the technology of launch facilities, which then give rise to the ability to access space, was based on military capabilities that were developed, in fact, in the Second World War by the Germans, the Nazis. Some of you will be aware they developed rocket capability, not to go into space, but rocket capability, their V1 and V2 programs that launched thousands of these rocket bombs into various places, including the UK. And then that technology was used to build more and more capabilities in space. Immediately after the war, and then leading up to and then after Sputnik, it was clear that space had great strategic value. And the two main space powers at the time, indeed perhaps the only two powers, the United States and the then former Soviet Union, saw immediately that strategic value in space and thought about space with military eyes. So all of the technologies that you and I use now, GPS, remote sensing, communication, and the list goes on and on, all of those things, all of those technologies were developed initially with military eyes, and then subsequently were then spun off so that they could be used for civil purposes, for commercial purposes, for humanistic purposes that you and I use them every day. And this bifurcation between peaceful uses of space and military uses of space, again, it's a political issue. And that was reflected in a sense, who would, at the United Nations, which plays an important part in the governance of these things, who would be in charge of this? So two committees were set up. I mentioned already the UNCOPOS, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That P is important, P for peaceful. And issues dealing with, if you like, weapons in space were to be dealt with in the body that ultimately became the United Nations Conference on Disarmament. COPOS is based in Vienna. The CD is based in Geneva, both at UN headquarters in those two countries. And so for a long time, COPOS would only talk about peaceful uses of space. And to the extent it was able to agree its agenda, and the CDs had many problems agreeing its scope of work, the weapons aspects of space were discussed amongst countries in the CD. But that has become less and less realistic, because space is one of those areas where the technology is increasingly what we call dual use. That is, the same space technology, let's say a communications satellite, can at the same time be used for civil and commercial and scientific and humanistic purposes, but also for military purposes. And so increasingly you are finding that commercial satellites have as their customer base, let's say television stations and a whole range of civil and other non-military customers. I'm sorry, could you turn your microphone on mute? Thank you. But also increasingly, the military is sometimes customers of these satellites as well. So it's a dual use domain more and more. The same asset might be doing a whole range of different things depending on which of the nodes of the satellite are being utilized by whom. So this idea that you can have peaceful uses and non-peaceful uses and separate the regulation becomes more and more artificial because of this dual use nature. And that is change. Therefore, this bifurcation is changing. But the language and the geopolitical aspects of space, more and more, and for me this is unfortunate, but this is real life, more and more from the military voices, you hear the notion of space as a warfighting domain. The establishment of so-called space forces, whether they're called that or something else, is happening in a number of countries. The idea that space is to be regarded as contested, congested, and competitive. That's what military people say about space. And therefore, from there, they say a war in space is inevitable. That is part of the geopolitics of the language of space. My view is We must listen to all of the voices. Those voices are important, but there are many, many, many other important voices as well. Because space is increasingly becoming commercial, and some describe it as democratized. So as I said, initially, going to space was regarded as something that only countries would do, although the treaties laid open the possibility that non-governmental entities would engage in space, even in the 1967 treaty, as long as states would take responsibility for those activities. If you fast forward to now, excuse me, there are many stakeholders who engage in space. Clearly, countries are still important, but so are intergovernmental organisations. Some of you would have heard of the European Space Agency, or Intersputnik, or EUMETSAT. And commercial entities are increasingly important. And as I say, there's a dual use aspect to much of what they provide. And also universities and researchers and entrepreneurs, and there's a whole range of things, such that the global space economy is booming. I heard a report yesterday that notwithstanding COVID, notwithstanding all of the pressures on the global economy, the space economy will be one of very few aspects of global economy, the other perhaps being medicine and pharmaceuticals, and one other being perhaps digitization in terms of connectivity, and the third is space. This report said those areas, so including space, are actually growing, notwithstanding all of the incredible strains and pressures that COVID is putting on every economy, and therefore thus the global economy. Even before COVID, the global economy was projected to grow at, let's say, 2 to 3%. Now, of course, it's going to be negative this year. But the space economy, which is obviously a small but growing subset of the global economy, is growing at between 8 and 10%. So that you'll see on the figures there, it's been guesstimated that in 2019, the global space economy was $415 billion US. That's a big number in the scheme of the global economy. Still, it's very, very small, but growing at 3, 4, 5, 6 times the global economy, such that it's projected to reach those numbers on the bottom bullet point very quickly. So this is a big area for commercial activities, as well as being, as was said before, strategic and military, and commercial and democratized. Space is these other things as well, science and exploration, and all sorts of civil uses, humanistic uses that have raised countries' standards of living across the world. It's all about cooperation. Even during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union cooperated in space on many aspects. And there's still cooperation going on in space amongst countries that terrestrially are obviously very tense with each other. Space is collaborative and communal. There are so many aspects to it. We have all common interests in maintaining space. And clearly it also is cultural. It has religious significance. I mentioned our Indigenous people, but that's just one of many, many examples. So space is tied to human rights inextricably. Our future, your future as a younger generation, your children, your children's children, all future generations, the future of those generations is tied up to the way we react, relate, and respect space. So I mentioned very briefly that the first of the treaties was a fundamental statement of principles, which the subsequent 4 treaties build upon, giving flesh, if you like, to some of these principles. But these principles are really important. These principles demonstrate how we behave as we move forward. They reinforce the communal, cooperative, and common areas of space. They say things about peaceful uses. They say things about a limitation on weapons. Not all weapons, but they say things about how we should be engaging in the future. They talk about states behaving in a way that is responsible, keeping everybody informed, cooperation. These are really important principles. They're as important today, even more important today, than they were in 1967. But clearly, notwithstanding how important they are and will continue to be, we all understand that the technology of space has raced forward, continues to race forward, and will, in the next 5 and 10 years, enable us to do things that even today we might think we can't do. Let alone in 1967, these things would never have been even contemplated. So it's important that we respect and build upon these principles and find other ways to deal with some of the specifics of the things that we do in space. So let me move towards the close of this talk, and then I'm very happy to hear any questions that come. What are the challenges that we have? Remembering that this technology is moving forward, remembering the ubiquitous nature of space, remembering the political nature of space. How does that work? The need for multilateralism. Well, we need to understand the questions that space technology poses. We need to understand that if we try to fix one aspect of space here, we have to be cognizant of the fact that our solution in this little area might impact on what we do over here, also regarding space. So we need to look at frameworks for space in a holistic way. We need to understand that band-aid solutions, what I call band-aid solutions, temporary fixes will in fact put us in a worse position, because once you start putting in legal or regulatory frameworks, it's very difficult to change them. So we're going to make sure that whatever we put in place really makes sense. People talk about future-proofing, trying to get our frameworks, our understandings, our consensual behavioural norms in place that will allow us to move forward as the technology moves forward. That's a very difficult concept. That's what we need to do, but it's difficult because sometimes it really means regulating for the unknown. Of course, we don't exactly know where the technology will take us. But what we do know is that in trying to work out the solutions, it's not just about the lawyers. It's not just about the diplomats and the politicians. It's about the scientists. It's about the economists. It's about the humanists. It's about the explorers. It's about the cultural aspects. It's about the human rights advocates. It's about a whole range of different people all being in the same room, essentially, to discuss how we move forward. That's the only way we're really going to find ways to complement these wonderful principles we already have in ways that are most appropriate for what we're going to do. In terms of the way technology moves forward, these are some of the major challenges. So I've already talked about sustainability. Probably the greatest challenge for us is the environment of space. Some of you might have heard of space junk, space debris. Space is a big place, but we have been polluting space at an exponential rate, to the point where if we continue at the current rate on a business as usual sort of model, we will reach that point of the tragedy of the commons. We will make space unsustainable. We will compromise our ability to utilize space in the future for us and for future generations. So we need to be highly cognizant of the notion of sustainability. We need to find ways to lessen and indeed reduce the debris. We must not repeat the mistakes that we've made on Earth in terms of the environment. Difficult issues. I've talked about the military aspects of space. We have to ensure that those loud voices that talk about military importance of space do not drown out all the other voices, because we must at all costs avoid the thinking that space must be weaponized. We must avoid at all costs an arms race in outer space. We must avoid at all costs a war in space. And so when military people talk about it being a war-fighting domain, being the wild, wild west, of course they do that because they are projecting their own agenda. They obviously are highlighting sensationalism about space to get budgets to fund themselves as for more and more of their own activities and more of their own development of technology. But there are many voices in space, and we must avoid that at all costs. Again, it's difficult. There are difficult issues. And so when countries are focusing on their ability to destroy satellites, their ability to develop weapons that will hamper others from engaging in space or whatever, they will encourage others to do the same thing. And we begin to have this spiral to the bottom. And it's something that we must avoid. Another major challenge will be, you're all aware of Starlink and so-called mega constellations, which are being driven by the developments in technology towards miniaturization, smaller satellites. That allows for this democratization because, of course, the cost and the ability to go to space are much simpler and lower because the satellites are much smaller. They won't replace the big satellites, but they will certainly allow us to do more and more things at a cheaper cost. But the idea of sending up many, many thousands of objects into space raises many challenges. Sure, it's seductive to say that we can do this and it will create, let's say, global internet for the third of the world that still doesn't have regular access to the internet. That's very seductive. That's very positive. But at the same time, let me give you some numbers. Since Sputnik, since the year I was born, we as a humanity have probably launched, let us say, 9,000 objects into space, there or thereabouts. If the well-publicized plans of just one or two companies come to fruition, in the next 5 or 10 years, we will have 90,000 more objects launched, 10 times the number of objects that we have launched since Sputnik. And so you can see, notwithstanding that our technology is getting better about how we deal with them when they die, because satellites die, and if they don't come back to orbit, if they're not deorbited, they are in space for a long time. They are debris. They are another potential collision risk. And so we need to work that out, notwithstanding that we might think of the advantages of these mega constellations. And that gives rise to understanding where satellites are, to being able to track them. And so notions of what is called space traffic management need to be developed. More than that, we need to also have a coordinated space and air traffic management, because we're going to have more and more launches to space, more and more returns from space because of the reusable technology that you're all aware of, and of course more and more humans going into space, so we really have to be careful. Human aerospace flight, space tourism, and then ultimately the goal is point-to-point flying, so I can fly from where I am to Bhopal in half an hour. Imagine that. Imagine you could come and visit me in Sydney in half an hour. That's the sort of ideas that aerospace flight might give rise to. Well, that will raise many, many issues from a legal perspective, and of course technical, and of course the effects on the body. But we need to deal with that because the technology seems to be moving forward, as it is for, as I said, the exploitation of the resources, the mining. As I said, the international community is looking at this. There are many different views from the, if you like, the major spacefaring nations differing from others. As I said, I have the privilege of chairing those discussions at the UN level, but there are many, many other conversations going on. And we need to find ways forward that make sense, that are agreed on a multilateral basis, that promote peaceful uses of space, that do not allow for colonization and worse still, conflict as people seek to grab resources. And then my last bullet point, even though it's not about space, is something you should also think about as well. Notwithstanding that we don't know where the demarcation is between airspace and outer space, we know this. We know that commercial aircraft when you fly, hopefully we'll all be able to fly again soon. When you fly in a commercial aircraft fly to an altitude of perhaps maximum 15 to 20 kilometers above the Earth. They are monitored in India, in Indian airspace, by your civil aviation authority, whatever it might be called. Every country has that. So we regulate very well that, if you like, first 20 kilometers. We don't know where space begins, but we know that, let's say, the lowest altitude where, with our current technology, you can have an orbit, because gravity, of course, would bring things down to Earth. The lowest altitude is somewhere around 80 or 90 kilometers above the Earth. And so you have, and we regulate space well. Okay, I'm not saying that's the demarcation of space, but let's just think about that for the minute, because my point is there's this area of between 20 and, let's say, 80 or 90 kilometers that is not regulated very well at all. But our technology is being developed for that as well, with so-called high altitude platforms and drones and balloons. And so as we develop the rules at an international but also national level, because that's clearly within airspace, as we develop those rules, we need to be cognizant of these high altitude platforms and pseudo satellites in that area as well. And countries are beginning now in their national space law to also include licensing regulation for high altitude platforms. And one example is New Zealand. I had the pleasure of drafting the New Zealand law. It started off when they first came to me and asked me to help them in the drafting. My mandate was help us draft our Space Activities Act. But over the 12 to 18 months that I was working with the government, the mandate changed, and they said, well, we need also to look at high altitude. And so when you look at the New Zealand law, it's called the Space and High Altitude Activities Act. So they recognise this middle area also needs to be regulated, and more countries will do that. I have no doubt in your country that will be the case as well. So my last slide is, here are the, you know, the challenges, you know, the importance of finding ways forward in these challenges. What should the overarching principles be in the way we do that? Well, for me, the overarching principles begin with this notion of common interests, notwithstanding that there are tensions on Earth, notwithstanding that every country, the fundamental rule of political science is that every country will act in its own best interests. We all understand that. But notwithstanding that, there is so much common interests in finding appropriate ways to behave in space that are not irresponsible, that do not cross lines. Why? Because if we do that, then we all suffer. So let me just contradistinct for you another great challenge for humanity: climate change and space. Okay, we're all aware of climate change. Okay, we all understand that some people disagree as to the causes of climate change, but we all agree that the climate is changing. We all agree that that is having lots of adverse consequences for humanity, for our environment, etc. If climate change continues unabated, we will all suffer. But who will suffer the most, at least initially? The ones that will suffer the most are the smaller countries, the small island states, the less powerful countries. They will suffer the most at the beginning, notwithstanding that we all suffer. If you look at outer space is dominated by major spacefaring nations, although more and more countries are beginning to have capability. But as I said, there's still a wide differential. If I act irresponsibly, and if I spoil that environment to this irreversible way, who suffers the most? The major spacefaring countries will suffer the most, because they have been able to utilize space to their advantage to help their industrialization, their development, gives them lots of comparative advantages, allows them to develop a whole range of capabilities, but they are highly dependent on that technology. And therefore they are highly vulnerable if that technology is compromised. So if we really get it wrong with space, then everybody suffers. Again, it's another tragedy of the commons. But who suffers the most? It's the major spacefaring countries. And I think that's a powerful message, that notwithstanding the rhetoric on earth, notwithstanding, and I'm beating my chest here if you can see, notwithstanding the chest beating that every country has to do in geopolitics to show that it has capabilities, etc. We all have this common interest to ensure that we don't ruin it, not only for everybody else, but because we will ruin it for ourselves, and that will dissipate our comparative advantage. That's really important. And the other two overarching principles, and these are my last points, are based on that and follow from that. Space, as I've said a number of times, is inextricably tied to the future of humanity. So we must, as we move forward, be cognizant of that. We must understand that as we move forward, and there are many exciting and amazing things we can do in space, but we must move forward in a way that recognizes how important space is for humanity, that recognizes that we should perhaps prioritize what we can do in space to maximize the benefits for humanity, and retain the notion that humanity is what space is about. It's not just an area that we exploit. It's an area that we depend on for our survival now and into the future, for our capabilities, for our standards of living, for our way of life. We depend on that now and into the future. So we must be cognizant of that. And that leads to my third and final overarching principle. In a sense, we're all stewards. We're stewards of the planet here on Earth, and we're stewards of outer space. We must respect space. We've made many, many mistakes regarding the environment of space. Now, this is not pointing the finger at anyone, okay? That has been the way humans have moved forward. But we have the opportunity not to make the same mistakes. We are headed in a bad direction in terms of some of our responsibilities as a steward of space, but it's not too late. We have to ensure that as we move forward, we recognize the need to maintain the integrity of space, the sustainability of space, the humanity of space, not only for ourselves, but for future generations as well. So I hope with those words that you have learnt a bit about, I'm just going to close my screen, there we are. I hope that's been of interest. I hope you've now heard about something that maybe you knew nothing about before and you thought, why am I listening to something on space? I hope that's at least given you some food for thought. And I hope that this has indeed perhaps ignited some of the minds of some of the people who have been listening about the wonders of space. And as I said, I hope everybody becomes a space junkie. And now when you look at space, perhaps you'll look at it with slightly different eyes as we move forward. So thank you. Let me thank again the university, JLU. Let me thank your Dean, Professor Dr. Shrivastava. Let me thank you, Abhishek, for all your organisation. You've made everything so easy for me. Let me thank Ms. Rucker. Thank you for moderating, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. It's a pleasure and a privilege. Please, I hope to have the opportunity that you might one day invite me to come and visit you, because I would love to come and see you in person and meet you. But in the meantime, this is the beginning of a friendship and a relationship, and I look forward to working with you and liaising with you. So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it back to our moderator if there are any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an enlightening session on this untouched issue of outer space and its future challenges. In your lecture, you have very elaborately discussed the phases of international space law, the multifaceted legal matrix of space law, and further, you also discussed the Outer Space Treaty and its future challenges. Moving ahead, we have few of the questions which have been asked to me by our students and the faculty members. I will be putting the first question to you. The first question which was asked was the fact that how far do you think the municipal legislations play an important role in accommodating the Outer Space Future Treaty?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. National law, municipal law as you call it, is incredibly important, because every country, India, Australia, and other parties to the Outer Space Treaty, we have obligations at the international level. So India has an obligation at the international level to ensure that anybody within its jurisdiction, in the activities that it or he or she may engage in, are not doing anything that would be in breach of those fundamental principles. So India has that obligation. And how does it ensure that? It ensures that by its national law. As I said, every country now, those countries are developing national laws to regulate those within their jurisdiction. One, to ensure that they act responsibly, to ensure that India implements its obligations into the national framework, the obligations it already has at the international level. This is really important. But more than that, national law can be an enabler. It can, for every country that I've worked with and others as well, the national law is a really helpful tool in encouraging appropriate entrepreneurship and industry, which will have economic benefits, will have cultural benefits, will have developmental benefits for the country. So the way you frame your national law is crucial. Every country will ask itself the same questions about what its national law should perhaps cover, but the answers for every country will be different because every country has different characteristics, ambitions, capabilities, risk profiles, which is why it's important for every country, India included, as you develop on an ongoing basis, your national framework, not only are you just bringing in your international obligations, but you're going to be doing that in a way that maximizes the benefit for your country. And that's where I've been very, very lucky to be able to help countries look at what they need and what they want and just help them and advise them to frame their national frameworks in a way that maximizes their own benefits, but also holds them out as responsible international citizens so that they can abide by their obligations and abide by their fundamental principles of humanity and stewardship. So national law, incredibly important. India's national space law is important, and it should be done in a way that is best for humanity, but also best for India.
The next question, sir, which has been asked by one of the students is, will the Outer Space Treaty lead to polarization in the powers with respect to the powers in hands of developed nations?
That's a really good question. We've had the Outer Space Treaty since 1967, as I said, and its fundamental underpinning premise is cooperation, is mutual assistance, is having due regard for the interests of others. Obviously, you want to promote your own interests, but you want to do it responsibly and in accordance with international law. So the treaty, in fact, its fundamental principles are bringing us together. So it's not the treaty that gives rise to polarization. What gives rise to polarization and is, firstly, as I've mentioned, this differentiation in capability. There are, if you like, space haves and space have-nots. And if you go back to my cake example, which I know is a silly example, but you see the idea, you know, where some can garner the benefits, others cannot do it because they do not have the capability. Yet that's a cake that belongs to all of us. So that leads to differentiation and polarization, differing views. Geopolitical tensions lead to polarization. And that's why, and I'm sorry to repeat this again, but people who have heard me talk elsewhere hear me say it again and again. We have to continually emphasize the common interests that space can take us all up. Sure, some of us will benefit far more quickly than others. We understand that. You know, it's not an equal world, but space will allow all of us to garner benefits. And so in the end, if we do that in a cooperative way, notwithstanding, as I said, every country will maximize its own position. Of course they do. That's what you expect your government to do. But they have to do that within the right framework. So the treaty and everything that we do at this multilateral level is based on consensus. It's based on mutual understandings. They're not the polarizing things. The polarizing things are perhaps sometimes the decision makers, the military people, the politicians, the diplomats, the whatever, who perhaps lose sight of some of those overarching principles that I've got. So please don't blame the treaty. The treaty is a good thing. It's how we implement it that's the important thing. And we all know that nothing is perfect, but we need to keep on emphasizing that need for commonality, common interests, without being unrealistic and recognizing it's a difficult world out there, a competitive world, but there's more to be gained in the sum of all of the parts together than individually. That's my point.
Thank you, sir. The next question is asked by one of our faculty members, Ms. Arohi Oja. The question is, Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty obligates states to avoid the harmful contamination of outer space. These norms are applicable to space debris and establish the duty not to pollute outer space by limiting the generation of debris. The waste of astronauts are still lying on Moon, which includes plastic waste as well. Where and how an action can be initiated against such actions, and how the dispute resolution works in such circumstances?
Oh, it's a great question, and if we had the answer, we would hopefully win the Nobel Peace Prize. Major issue is the pollution of space, the environment of space. Space activities are inherently polluting, because ultimately things might fall off the object. Ultimately, unless it's at a very low altitude, when the object dies, it stays there for many, many hundreds of years. So it is debris. It is not maneuverable. You have to get out of its way. It won't move for you. So space is inherently polluting. The strategies that we've engaged in mirror some of the mistakes we've had on Earth. The initial strategy about the environment of space was, well, it's big, we shouldn't even worry about it. Already in the 70s, some NASA scientists, a famous scientist known as Mr. Kessler, postulated that if we keep on doing that, we're going to eventually create so much debris that the possibility of collision is high. And of course, collision between two objects, each moving. Remember, these things are moving at unbelievable speeds, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 kilometers a second, depending on which orbit they are. So any collision, even something as big as that, if it hits the International Space Station, will destroy the International Space Station because of the kinetic energy generated by those speeds. And so Mr. Kessler postulated that if we continue doing what we're doing and not even worrying about the environment of space, we will create so much debris that this collision risk becomes unacceptable. That will, of course, create more debris. There's this cascading effect, and we go to a point of beyond return. We hopefully have not yet reached that point yet, but we have to find solutions. And the solutions are difficult. So what we've attempted to do in space is work out debris mitigation strategies, and the UN has as one of its soft law guidelines, it's called the debris mitigation strategy, the debris mitigation guidelines. And last year, as a supplement, the UN COPOLOS agreed the long-term sustainability of outer space guidelines. Guidelines, not binding, but really reflecting best practice that all states are urged to implement into their national frameworks and their activities to minimize the additional creation of debris. But that's not enough. So strategies are now being developed and technologies to actually remove debris. And I've given lots of talks on that, but that itself has not only major technical issues, but many legal issues. But we have to overcome that. So major problems. So if I may say, when a country or an entity deliberately creates debris, that is behavior that clearly goes against everything that we're striving for. We're striving to lessen the production of debris. We're striving, in the best possible case, to remove debris. Therefore, it's incredibly important that states and entities behave responsibly. And so when you have situations where debris is deliberately created, or where countries do not care about the debris that might emanate from their project, that makes it harder for us. So we need to move forward. We need to find ways. But of course, it's like climate change. It's like many other things. It costs a lot of money. You know, no states will accept that they are responsible for this pollution. No states will say it's my responsibility to clean it up. Other states will say, well, you know, you develop this pollution in your in the way you industrialize, so why can't we do the same? We have a right to industrialize. You know, there are all those sorts of conflicting issues. They're very complex. But in the end, it goes back to the common interest. It goes back to the recognition that at some point, if we don't all behave responsibly, if we don't all find solutions to this, then we will all not be able to maximize our utilization of space. So we will find ways, because we have to find ways. But again, it's difficult. The solutions we have at the moment are non-binding, they're useful, they're best practices. I would like to see more stronger, more direct, more specific ways of dealing with this with really harsh dispute resolution mechanisms. But I'm just one person. You know, we need to get countries to agree to that. And as you can imagine, with the same discussions about who is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions historically, etc., many geopolitical issues come up. And these are difficult issues, but civil society needs to pressure the decision makers, and we need to understand that we need to address this together.
Thank you so much, sir. Again, the next question is asked by one of our students, that in recent years, the military space news has been very regular. And as it is said that every coin has two faces, so how far do you think the Outer Space Treaty has been a bane for military operations?
Well, that's a very good question. So there you need to look at the context, right? Remember, I said that the treaties and the Outer Space Treaty were in the height of the Cold War. And yet, when you look at the principles in that treaty, like the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which is also in the height of the whole Cold War, but when you look at the Outer Space Treaty, it is a remarkable document. A remarkable document where, in the height of this incredible geopolitical tension, the two superpowers, essentially, because we would never have had the treaty without the two superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union, agreeing, and of course everyone else, but clearly the two superpowers agreed that space was different, space was unique. We need to find ways that we don't wreck it. Obviously, it was in their self-interest to do that, because they saw that they had great possibilities to have strategic advantages over everybody else by utilizing space. But it's a remarkable document. That said, it doesn't ban all military activities, but you could not expect at that time a document in the midst of the Cold War to say you cannot engage in any military activity at all in space. It does prohibit certain types of activities. It does specify on celestial bodies it's exclusively for peaceful use. It does ban the placement of certain types of weapons. It's not comprehensive. But if you read the treaty, as there are rules about how you read treaties, if you read the objective and purpose of the treaty in terms of peacefulness and cooperation and due regard, if you look at the context of the treaty, if you read the relevant articles about it, you will recognize that, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union would never have agreed to a blanket ban on any military activities, because it wasn't in their interest to do that. But it was a remarkable step forward. And the treaty has a lot to say about non-military uses. However, it would be ideal if we augment those principles, perhaps with protocols or whatever, that ban all weapons in space, that ban certain types of activities in space. We don't have that. I would say the underlying fundamental principles and sentiments of the treaties already have a lot to say about that. But of course, it would be ideal if we could do that in a more agreed fashion. But of course, the militaries in many countries have loud voices, and they're there to protect you and I, of course, we understand that. But we need to overcome this thinking that space somehow is a free-for-all in terms of military. It's not, it can't be, it never has been, and it must not be in the future.
Thank you, sir. The next question is again asked by one of our faculty members, Mr. Abhishek Kumar Jain. Can we see a substantial career opportunities in space law? If yes, then how can a law graduate pursue a career in this field?
No, that's a great question, Abhishek. As I said, firstly, become a space junkie, but I think you probably are after that. It would be wonderful, for example, if your university taught space law. And I know quite a number of universities do. I mean, I'm close to a number of Indian universities, and there are some well-known Indian scholars who have done a lot in space law. India participates in, there's a space law moot court competition. That's run by the International Institute of Space Law. I'm a director of that, and in fact just judged an Indian team in the world semi-final. So congratulations to India. There are career opportunities, and it's not just looking at, and I'll hold it up, it's not just looking at the outer space treaties and the UN documents. Space is so ubiquitous. So from a law perspective, it's highly commercial. So if you think about it, insurance companies and television stations and radio broadcasters and navigation centers and, you know, a whole range of commerce is reliant on space, right? So there are many, many commercial transactions in space. You saw my numbers about the commercial aspects of space. So there's a huge career for, if you like, commercial lawyers in space. There's a huge career for advocates in space on a whole range of issues. There's a huge career in diplomacy and in government, because space is so important for every government, including yours and mine. There's a huge career for working for industry in developing these things. You need to be cognizant of the fundamental principles of space. You need to be cognizant of the national frameworks, and you need to then be able to fit that in with your industry capability. So working for industry. There are many, many broad aspects. I mean, a law degree generally is an incredibly enabling degree. And in space, there are many opportunities. So perhaps teach space law. I'd be privileged if you invited me one day to come and teach a space law course at your university, but of course there are many good people. But get people interested in space. Recognize that it's also relevant for environment and human rights and humanitarian law and economics and culture and the way your government operates and industry. Recognize that multifaceted and recognize how important it is for all of us. And I dare say more and more, if you like, career opportunities will come out of that. I'm convinced about that. So hopefully many of the students watching, hopefully some of the faculty watching might scratch their heads now and think, well, yeah, maybe there's an opportunity in that area or something.
It has certainly encouraged us to plan a particular event, keeping in mind the opportunities of career in space law for sure. And we can definitely conceive one event in which we can have your kind presence.
Oh, thank you, Abhishek. I'm grateful. I mean, there are many good people. It's just that, you know, now that I've learned a bit about your university and I've met you, of course, I'd be honoured and delighted to work with you.
Lastly, I have one question. So one of the recommendations made in the third United Nations Conference of Exploration and Peaceful Uses of Outer Space was that more attention should be paid to the protection of intellectual property rights in viewing of the commercialization of the space. How far do you think are intellectual properties protected in this outer space?
Oh, that's a great question and a really difficult question. Thank you for that. I'm not an intellectual property lawyer. I'm an international lawyer, you know, so I have a little bit of knowledge, but I'm sure somebody on your faculty would know more about intellectual property. But clearly, as you can imagine, with more and more commercial activities in space, a whole range of issues arise. Patents arise, you know. So, for example, pharmaceutical companies may find that their ability to create certain types of pharmaceuticals in a zero gravity environment in space, you know, gives them greater opportunities. They might need patent protection. technologies that you develop for space need patent protection. Copyright and copyright of information that you utilize from space needs protection. There are a whole range of examples that I could give you where intellectual property protection is important. Now, you're all aware that intellectual property protection, by and large, is done on a national scale. I understand there's a world, there's WIPO, but by and large, Indian intellectual property law is perhaps slightly different from Japanese intellectual property law in Australia. It's done on a national basis, and we are now talking about an area beyond national jurisdiction. So we need to address this. On the International Space Station, they have addressed it. So I should make that point in closing. You will recall that I said Indian national law does not apply to space. Indian national law does not apply to the high seas, but Indian national law applies to Indian flagged vessels. We have a similar, if you like, registration, similar but different registration scheme for space. So Indian law would apply to Indian space objects or people inside it if you had a human one. Not to the space, but to the object. So within, like aircraft, like ships, like space objects. So on the International Space Station, for example, where you have cooperation, again, here's another great example of cooperation in space, right? By many countries, Russia, the United States, Japan, Canada, 11 European countries, they developed this station where humans are and where national law has to apply. And you know what they did? They followed a registration pattern, which was that when you're in the Japanese part, the Kibo module of the space station, Japanese law applies. And when you're in the American part of the space station, American law applies. And when you're in the European section, that's tough because 11 countries' laws apply because the ESA involvement involved 11 countries, and et cetera, et cetera. When you're in the Russian area, Russian law applies. So they solved on an ad hoc basis the intellectual property issues by working out what national law applied in different parts of the space station. Now that works for the space station because it's an ad hoc solution. It's not a solution for space. It's not a solution when we have 3D printing on the moon. It's not a solution when we have permanent human settlements. It's not a solution for a whole range of other autonomous technologies in space or whatever. So we will need to develop further ways of trying to address this idea of intellectual property protection. But of course, it's not straightforward. That's why you need experts who understand space law, because of the unique legal status of space. But you're absolutely right, Ms. Raquel, that's absolutely an important question, an important issue. And as more and more commercial entities are throwing lots and lots of money into space to develop technology, they want that protection. They want commercial certainty and legal protections, including intellectual property right protection. So this is another issue, I should have had it on my challenges issue, another really important issue that there are many discussions going on. So thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an interactive session. Moving ahead to the end of the session, it is my extreme honor to propose vote of thanks on behalf of the university. On behalf of the Jagran Lakecity University School of Law, I am extremely thankful to Professor Dr. Stephen Freeland. Today, your writing talk on safeguarding humanity and embracing technology, challenges for the future regulation of outer space, was an eye-opener for all of us. On behalf of Jagran Lakecity University, I express my heartfelt gratitude to you for accepting this invitation and gracing us with your presence and address on this virtual platform. I am also thankful to Honorable Chancellor Shri Hari Mohan Gupta ji, Honorable Pro-Chancellor Shri Abhishek Mohan Gupta, and Honorable Vice-Chancellor Professor Dr. Anup Swarup for creating and nurturing the perfect ecosystem for us to organize such events. I am thankful to our Dean, Professor Dr. Yogen Kumar Srivastava, for being the guiding torch and leading us to thrive in our academic endeavors. I'm also thankful to my fellow program leaders and faculty members for their support. I also acknowledge the support which is extended by Mr. Kuber, ERP administrator, who facilitates our online sessions in this great way. Thanks a lot, sir. Lastly, thank you to all our beloved students, and I am sure we have You have many takeaways from this lecture which will enrich your classroom discussions. I wish for the good health and safety of everyone. Thank you and take care.
Thank you very much. I wish you all well, and thank you again for the honor of having the chance to speak to you, and take care. And hopefully in better days, we will have the opportunity to meet in person. Thank you
Certainly.
again.
It was a great honor to have you in this lecture series, and this would be the final lecture of this International Igniting Mind lecture series, which we started on 29th August. And just like any other season finale, should always end the proceedings on a very high note. I'm sure your lecture has done this very well. And all of those 370 plus students who attended this session, as you said, that must have certainly developed some curiosity and inclination towards understanding the nuances of the space law, which will definitely be a great value addition for their career in the future. So from the bottom of my heart, I express my gratitude to you, sir, for accepting this invitation and delivering this presentation in such an intriguing way. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for all your help. Okay, I
you,
wish
sir.
you well, and everybody stay safe and healthy, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir.
We will look forward to it.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you,
Bye-bye.
sir.